The night was bitterly cold, and the alleyway where Jacob sat seemed to swallow all warmth. His clothes, thin and torn, offered no protection against the freezing air. Shivering uncontrollably, Jacob leaned against the rough brick wall, his mind wandering to memories of better days. He had once had a life, a home, a family, but everything changed. Now, all he had left was the faint memory of those moments, and Max, his golden retriever, was his only constant. As always, Max lay by his side, his fur matted with the constant rain. The dog's eyes glimmered with an alertness Jacob had learned to trust. Despite the darkness and danger that loomed, Max never let him feel alone. As the rain began to pour harder, Jacob pulled his thin jacket tighter around him, trying to shield himself from the cold. But Max's stance shifted. His body went rigid, his ears perked. Jacob, exhausted from the struggle to survive, barely noticed at first. But when Max growled softly, a deep rumble that vibrated through the air, Jacob's attention snapped to the dog. Max's fur bristled, the kind of tension that accompanied a real threat, not just a passing stranger. Jacob felt a shiver down his spine, not from the cold, but from an instinctual fear that gripped him. Something was coming. The heavy downpour seemed to blur the world, the distant sound of thunder adding to the tension. Jacob couldn't remember a time when he had felt so alone, even with Max by his side. The dog had always been a shield, but tonight, something was different. Max's growl deepened, like a low rumble of thunder. Jacob squinted into the darkness, trying to make out any figures in the distance. His breath came out in shaky clouds, and his pulse quickened. In the oppressive silence, he heard footsteps. Faint, but growing closer. His heart beat faster. Max stood up, his body poised and alert. The dog's eyes glowed in the dim light. His ears flattened against his head as he positioned himself between Jacob and the source of the noise. Jacob shifted nervously, but Max didn't take his eyes off the approaching strangers. "What's going on, boy?" Jacob whispered, his voice hoarse. Max's response was a low, continuous growl. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and everything was eerily quiet. Then, from the shadows, figures began to emerge. They were hooded, their faces obscured. Their movements were deliberate, like predators stalking prey. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know who they were, but their intentions were clear. They meant trouble. Max's growl deepened into a snarl, a warning that would not be ignored. The figures circled Jacob and Max, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their eyes cold and calculating. Jacob's heart raced. He had been through rough patches, but this felt different. These weren't just desperate people looking for handouts. They were predators, and Max was the only thing standing between them and Jacob. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the threat of violence. Jacob's body froze, but Max, unafraid, was ready. The dog's muscles coiled as he growled louder, the sound echoing through the narrow alley. "Get away from us!" Jacob shouted, trying to sound braver than he felt, but his voice trembled. One of the figures laughed darkly, stepping forward. "What's this? A stray dog trying to protect his master," he sneered. But Max wasn't backing down. The dog bared his teeth and lunged, his small but determined body knocking into the attacker. The figure stumbled back, caught off guard. Jacob's eyes widened in disbelief. "Max!" Jacob shouted, as the dog continued to bite at the man's arm. The rest of the group hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do with the brave dog. But Max wasn't just protecting a man. He was protecting Jacob's last shred of dignity. The attackers backed away slowly, growling in frustration. The sight of a dog standing so fiercely in defense of its owner was unexpected. In the end, it wasn't fear of violence that made them leave. It was Max's unwavering loyalty. As the attackers retreated into the night, Max returned to Jacob's side, his fur soaked and his breathing heavy. Jacob's hands trembled as he reached out to stroke the dog's wet head. "You saved us, Max," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking. Max leaned against him, resting his head on Jacob's lap as if to reassure him that everything would be okay. The alley had returned to silence, but for Jacob, it felt like a war had been fought and won. And the soldier who stood beside him was his dog, his best friend. The two of them, bound by survival, had faced the darkness together. Jacob closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the reality of what had just happened to sink in. "You're more than just a dog to me," he murmured, his voice soft but filled with emotion. Max's tail wagged weakly, as though he understood. Jacob realized, in that quiet moment, that the love and loyalty Max offered were not just acts of survival. They were acts of a deep, unbreakable bond, one that would carry them through the darkest of nights, and one that would change the course of their lives forever. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the rain began to subside. The city that never slept had quieted, but for Jacob and Max, the night's danger lingered in their hearts. Max lay beside him, eyes half closed, still alert despite the calm. Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had always known Max was loyal, but after the events of the night, it became clear just how far that loyalty stretched. Jacob's breath hitched as he thought about how close he had come to losing everything, how close he had come to losing Max. In the hours following the attack, Jacob had tried to rest, but his mind kept returning to the dog's bravery. Max had given everything to protect him. He stroked Max's fur gently, letting the warmth of the dog's presence calm him. The bond between them had deepened in those moments, stronger than any words could express. "Thank you, boy," Jacob whispered, his voice hoarse. Max nuzzled his hand, offering a comfort that spoke louder than any response. Jacob's eyes softened as he realized something profound. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living alongside his dog, and together they could face anything. For the next few days, Jacob and Max found themselves in a new rhythm. Jacob's heart no longer raced with fear when he woke in the cold, wet alley. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose. With Max beside him, Jacob wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something greater, their shared bond. He began to notice small, meaningful moments that brought them comfort. The way Max would nuzzle him when Jacob felt particularly low. The way Max's eyes seemed to understand his unspoken worries. The dog wasn't just a companion. He was a reason to keep going. Each day, Jacob felt his strength grow. Max had shown him that even in the deepest despair, there was hope. Jacob started helping other homeless people when he could. He'd offer food, share his blanket, or simply lend a listening ear. Max would stand by, his head cocked slightly, as if to say, "This is the way." It wasn't much, but it was something. The city, once a place of pain and isolation, started to feel a little bit smaller. It was still hard. Every day was a battle. But Jacob wasn't fighting alone anymore. And neither was Max. It was a quiet afternoon when a man approached Jacob and Max in the park. Jacob was sitting on the cold concrete bench, his dog by his side, watching the world go by. The man, dressed in a tailored suit and carrying a briefcase, stopped a few feet away. His eyes were kind, but his hesitation was palpable. "Hey, buddy," the man said gently, crouching down in front of Max. "Is this your dog's?" Jacob nodded, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Yeah, he's mine, Max." The man smiled and rubbed Max's head. "He's a good dog," he said, before pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "I see you're out here every day, and I wanted to offer you something." Jacob took the paper, feeling the weight of the man's words. It was a small card with a number on it. "Call me if you need help. There are people who care, you know." Jacob stared at the card, unsure how to react. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers. But as the man walked away, his heart began to race. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. Max, sensing the shift, licked Jacob's hand reassuringly, his tail wagging. The card burned a hole in Jacob's pocket. It wasn't much, a simple piece of paper with a number, but was more than Jacob had ever received in years. He hadn't reached out yet. It felt like a step into the unknown, something Jacob wasn't sure he was ready for. But Max seemed to sense the change. The dog had become a symbol of hope for Jacob, not just in their own lives, but now, potentially, for the future. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the ground, Jacob looked down at Max, who rested his head on Jacob's lap. "What do you think, boy?" Jacob muttered, his voice barely audible. Max's eyes lifted, locking with his owner's. For a moment, there was nothing but quiet understanding. Jacob ran his fingers through the dog's fur, considering the offer. He could keep wandering the streets, surviving day by day, or he could take a leap of faith. Call the number. Trust in the kindness of a stranger. It was terrifying, and yet, in the pit of his stomach, Jacob knew that it was the right thing to do. For himself. For Max. Jacob stood at the payphone, the card clenched tightly in his hand. He was about to do something he hadn't done in years, reach out for help. Max sat by his side, his golden fur soft against the cold pavement. The phone was old, the cord twisted, but Jacob felt a sense of purpose as he dialed the number. Each digit felt like a step away from everything he had known, a step toward a different life. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Then the line clicked. "Hello," a voice answered on the other end. Jacob froze for a moment, unsure of what to say. But Max's reassuring gaze made him take a deep breath. "Hi," Jacob said, his voice shaky. I got your card. I'm Jacob. I need help." There was a pause, and then the voice on the other end softened. "I'm glad you called. Let's see what we can do for you." It was the first time in years that Jacob had heard someone speak to him with genuine kindness. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The days that followed the phone call were filled with uncertainty and anticipation. Jacob barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The man who had given him the card had promised to help, but would it be enough to change his life? He clutched the small card in his pocket, feeling the weight of the promise it represented. Max, as always, stayed close, offering silent support. It was hard for Jacob to trust that things could be different now. After all, he had learned the hard way that people rarely offered help without expecting something in return. Still, he clung to the hope that this was the beginning of something new. The number on the card led to a local shelter, a place where Jacob could start over. That afternoon, Jacob and Max made their way there, the familiar streets suddenly feeling different. As they approached the shelter, Jacob felt a mixture of fear and excitement. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a step. Max wagged his tail, sensing his owner's nervousness. "You're right, boy," Jacob muttered. One step at a time, together, they walked inside. The bright lights and warm air were a stark contrast to the cold streets they had come from. Jacob felt a strange sense of comfort as the shelter staff greeted them with kind smiles. Maybe, just maybe, this was the fresh start they needed. The shelter offered more than just food and shelter. It offered something Jacob had long forgotten, the feeling of belonging. The staff treated him with respect, offering him a warm bed and a chance to clean up. It was a small thing, but for Jacob, it was monumental. Max, of course, was allowed to stay by his side, as always. The dog's presence was more than just a comfort. It was a reminder of how far they had come together. The shelter was filled with others who had fallen on hard times, and yet, for the first time in years, Jacob didn't feel completely alone. The other residents of the shelter shared stories of struggle and survival, but also of hope. They had all been where Jacob was, and now they were working to rebuild their lives. There was a sense of camaraderie, a feeling that, no matter how difficult the road ahead, they weren't in it alone. Jacob started to open up, little by little, sharing pieces of his past and his dreams for the future. Max sat loyally at his feet, his eyes filled with understanding. The dog's loyalty had never wavered, and it was a reminder to Jacob that, with Max by his side, anything was possible. One morning, while Jacob was out walking Max near the shelter, he met a man named Peter. Peter was in his late 40s, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were kind. He had a weathered face, one that seemed to tell a story of its own. He had been a regular at the shelter for months, always quick with a smile or a word of encouragement for the newer residents. "Hey there," Peter greeted Jacob, nodding at Max. "You've got a good dog. He's been keeping you company, huh?" Jacob smiled shyly. "Yeah, he's all I've got." Peter studied him for a moment before sitting down next to him on the bench. "You know, I've been where you are," Peter said quietly, looking down at his hands. "It feels like you're stuck, like nothing will ever get better. But it does. You just have to keep pushing forward. I've been here a while now, and life has changed. It's not perfect, but it's better." Jacob listened intently, feeling a glimmer of hope stir within him. Peter had made it through, and if he could, so could Jacob. With Max by his side, Jacob knew he wasn't alone in this fight. Jacob had never been good at trusting people. Life on the streets had taught him that most people couldn't be counted on. But as the days turned into weeks, Jacob began to realize that not everyone in the shelter was there to take advantage of him. Slowly, he began to let his guard down, especially with Peter, who had become something of a mentor to him. Peter's words had planted a seed of hope in Jacob's heart, and now that seed was beginning to sprout. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Peter asked, "What's your plan, Jacob? Where do you see yourself in a year?" Jacob hesitated, unsure of how to answer. His life had been filled with so many unanswered questions. But as he looked at Max, who lay at his feet, eyes closed in contentment, he felt a flicker of possibility. "I don't know," Jacob admitted, "but I want more. I want to be able to take care of myself and Max." Peter smiled, as if he had expected this answer all along. "That's a start," he said. "Just take it one day at a time. The rest will come." Jacob nodded. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe in the future. Life in the shelter was starting to feel more like a new beginning than a place of temporary refuge. But even though things were better, the process of change was not without its challenges. Jacob had to face old habits, like his tendency to isolate himself or his fear of reaching out for help. But with each passing day, he grew stronger. Max had always been his rock, but now he also had people to lean on. The shelter support groups and job placement programs were starting to give Jacob a sense of direction. He took small steps each day, whether it was attending a job training session or volunteering to help out around the shelter. Max, of course, was always by his side, reminding him that no matter how difficult things got, he didn't have to face them alone. One day, as Jacob was walking to the shelter's office to inquire about a job opportunity, he stopped and looked at Max. "This is it, boy," he said softly. "This is the start of something new." Max wagged his tail, as if to say, "We've got this." Jacob smiled, feeling a renewed sense of determination. With Max by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Weeks passed, and Jacob's confidence grew. He had begun to learn new skills, attended job interviews, and worked hard to build a life that was stable enough for him and Max. Then, one morning, as Jacob sat in the shelter's community room, a woman approached him with a flyer. "There's a job opening at a local pet store," she said. "It's part-time, but it's a start." Jacob took the flyer, his hands shaking slightly. He had never worked in retail before, but he knew that working at a pet store could be a perfect fit. He had spent years taking care of Max, and his bond with animals was something he was proud of. "It's worth a shot," he thought, staring down at the flyer. With Max by his side, he felt ready to take the next step. The idea of working with animals filled him with hope. For the first time in years, Jacob believed that the future could hold something good for him and Max. Jacob woke up early, a mixture of excitement and nervousness swirling inside him. Today was his first day at the pet store. The flyer that had given him hope was now more than just a piece of paper. It was the key to a new life. Max stood beside him, sensing his anxiety. The dog's eyes were filled with that silent understanding that only a pet could offer. Jacob ran a hand over Max's head, taking in the familiar warmth. "You ready for this, boy?" he whispered. Max wagged his tail, his usual response. Jacob dressed carefully, trying to shake off the butterflies in his stomach. As he walked into the store, The overwhelming scent of pet food and the sound of soft music greeted him. The manager, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, introduced herself as Sarah. She showed Jacob around, explaining the duties of the job. Despite his nerves, Jacob quickly settled into the rhythm of the work, and soon he found himself enjoying the company of the animals. Max had always been his emotional anchor, but now Jacob was beginning to feel the first true sense of independence. The work was hard, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt proud of himself. At the end of the day, Max lay on the floor beside him, the quiet comfort of his presence reminding Jacob that, no matter how hard things got, they would face it together. Jacob's new job at the pet store felt like a breath of fresh air, but the real change was in the way he viewed himself. No longer the homeless man who wandered the streets, Jacob was now a man with purpose, a man with a chance. It wasn't easy. There were moments when doubt crept in, and he wondered if he was really cut out for this. But every time he looked at Max, every time the dog's gentle eyes met his, Jacob found the strength to keep going. The shelter had become more than just a place to stay. It was a community, and Jacob was beginning to feel part of it. The other residents, once strangers, had become his friends. Peter, in particular, offered advice and encouragement, always reminding Jacob that every step forward mattered, no matter how small. It was through these interactions that Jacob began to realize how much he had changed. He wasn't just surviving. He was building a life, brick by brick. Max was with him every step of the way, his unwavering loyalty reminding Jacob that he wasn't alone in this. The road to rebuilding his life wasn't going to be quick or easy, but with his dog and the support of new friends, Jacob knew he was on the right path. Just when things seemed to be falling into place, life threw Jacob a curveball. One morning, he received a phone call from the pet store. Sarah, the manager, informed him that due to financial constraints, they had to reduce his hours. "It's just temporary," she reassured him, but the news hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he felt that familiar sense of helplessness creep in. He had fought so hard to get here, to finally have something stable, and now it was slipping away. Max seemed to sense his distress, standing up and nuzzling his owner's hand as if offering silent comfort. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. He was tired of fighting, tired of hoping, tired of setbacks. But then he remembered something Peter had told him. It's not the setbacks that define us, but how we rise from them. Jacob stood up, taking a deep breath. The road wasn't going to be easy, but it had never been. Max looked at him with those loyal eyes, as if telling him it wasn't over yet. Jacob knew one thing for sure. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not when he had come this far. The next few days were difficult for Jacob. The reduction in hours meant he had to be more resourceful, stretching the little money he had. But as he walked through the shelter, he started to notice something new. People were starting to rally around him. Sarah from the pet store called to check in, offering to work with him on more flexible hours. Peter invited Jacob to a community meeting where they discussed job opportunities and financial management. These small gestures made Jacob feel supported, like he was part of something bigger than himself. Max was a constant presence, his quiet companionship grounding Jacob when the stress became overwhelming. "We'll get through this, boy," Jacob murmured one night as he sat with Max, his fingers tracing the dog's fur. The dog's steady breathing was a reminder that life was always moving forward, one moment at a time. Jacob realized then that resilience wasn't about avoiding challenges. It was about facing them head-on, knowing that no matter how tough things got, he wasn't facing them alone. With Max by his side and a growing network of support, Jacob knew he could weather any storm. Weeks passed, and Jacob's situation slowly began to improve. His hours at the pet store increased, and he had started to save a little money. But what truly surprised him was the opportunity that came his way one evening at the shelter. One of the staff members, a woman named Rachel, approached Jacob with an idea. "We're looking for someone to help with the shelter's outreach program," she explained. "You've got a way with people, Jacob. You could be a real asset." Jacob was taken aback. He had never considered working in a role that involved helping others, but the idea resonated with him. He had been helped so much on his own journey, and now he wanted to give back. The outreach program would allow him to share his story, offer advice to those who were just beginning their own journeys, and help them find the support they needed. "What do you think?" Rachel asked. Jacob looked at Max, who was lying by his feet, and then back at Rachel. "I think it's time," he said with a determined smile. It was time to stop just surviving and start truly living. Jacob was ready to make a difference, not just in his life, but in the lives of others as well. Jacob's new role in the shelter's outreach program brought a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known before. He began leading support groups for others who were struggling, offering advice and encouragement. He shared his story openly, talking about his journey from the streets to finding a stable life, with Max by his side. Many of the residents looked up to him, and he could see the hope flickering in their eyes, the same hope he had once felt when he was given the opportunity to change his life. Max always accompanied him to the shelter, his loyal presence a reminder to everyone that love and support could come from unexpected places. Jacob found purpose in his new role. He helped others navigate the same difficult path he had walked, offering them practical advice and emotional support. As he listened to their stories, he realized how much he had grown, not just as a person, but as a mentor. Jacob's resilience had become a beacon for others, and he was proud to be a part of their journey toward a better life. Jacob's new role in the outreach program was more than just a job. It had become a calling. Each day, he was meeting more people, hearing their stories, and offering the same support that had once been given to him. As the days passed, Jacob began to realize that the shelter was more than just a place for survival. It had become a home for him. The other residents had become his extended family, and the sense of community was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Max was, of course, always by his side, a constant reminder that he was never truly alone. One evening, after a particularly difficult support group, Jacob sat with Peter outside, the night air cool and refreshing. "You've come a long way, Jacob," Peter said with a proud smile. "When you first arrived, you could barely look anyone in the eye. Now, you're leading others." Jacob smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, without Max," he replied, his voice full of emotion. "You both showed me what real loyalty and friendship look like." The two men sat together in silence, watching the stars. Jacob had found something he never thought possible, a new family, and it was more than he could have ever hoped for. Jacob's hard work at the shelter and his dedication to helping others had not gone unnoticed. One afternoon, Sarah, the manager at the pet store, called him into her office. Jacob's heart raced. Had something gone wrong? Had he lost his job? But as he sat across from Sarah, she smiled warmly. "Jacob, I've been watching your progress, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You've come so far, and I think you're ready for more responsibility." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a job offer for a full-time position at the pet store. Jacob stared at it in disbelief. The offer was step up, with a higher pay rate and more hours. This was the opportunity he had been working toward for months. "Thank you," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." Sarah smiled. "You don't have to say anything. You've earned this." As Jacob left the store that afternoon, his heart swelled with pride. This was the moment he had been working for, the moment that proved he could change his life. And Max was there, wagging his tail, as always, ready to face the future together. While Jacob's new job at the pet store was a dream come true, it brought with it new challenges. The long hours, the responsibility, and the pressure to perform sometimes felt overwhelming. He had always been used to doing things on his own, but now, with a stable job and new commitments, Jacob found himself struggling to maintain balance. At times, it felt like he was walking a tightrope, trying to juggle the demands of work, the outreach program at the shelter, and his personal life. Max, ever the loyal companion, stayed close to Jacob, sensing his stress. One night, as Jacob sat on the couch after a particularly long day, Max climbed into his lap, resting his head on Jacob's chest. The dog's calming presence reminded Jacob of what truly mattered. I've got to keep it together, haven't I, boy? Jacob whispered. Max gave a soft sigh, his eyes closing in contentment. Jacob knew that as long as he had Max by his side, he could handle whatever came his way. The key was not to let the challenges overwhelm him, but to take things one day at a time. Slowly, Jacob learned to manage his time better, prioritizing his health, his work, and, of course, his bond with Max's life wasn't perfect, but it was finally starting to feel like it was on the right track. Jacob thought he had left his past behind him, but one evening, while walking Max in the park, he encountered a man from his past, someone he had known during his time on the streets. The man's face was dirty, his eyes hollow, and his clothes ragged. When he saw Jacob, he froze for a moment before approaching. Jacob, the man asked, his voice rough. I can't believe it's you. I heard about you getting your life together. How did you do it? Jacob felt a mix of emotions, surprise, guilt, and even shame. He had worked so hard to move forward, to distance himself from the past. Yet here it was, staring him in the face. The man, whose name was Tom, shared how he had fallen back into old habits, how he was still stuck in the cycle of homelessness and addiction. Jacob listened quietly, his heart heavy. He wanted to help Tom, but he knew that he couldn't save him if Tom wasn't ready to change. You've got to want it, Tom, Jacob said softly. You've got to believe that you deserve better. Tom's eyes looked away, filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. Maybe one day, he muttered, before walking off into the night. Jacob stood there, Max at his side, feeling a deep sadness for the man he used to be, but also a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't change the past, but he could keep moving forward, and maybe, just maybe, help others along the way. As Jacob's life continued to improve, he began to realize something important. He had neglected his own well-being for far too long. He had been so focused on work, on the shelter, and on helping others that he had forgotten to take care of himself. It wasn't that he didn't care about his health. It was just that he had never really learned how to prioritize his own needs. Max, however, was a constant reminder of the importance of balance. The dog was always happy, always content, no matter what was going on in Jacob's life. Jacob, on the other hand, had become worn out. His energy was depleted, and his stress levels were higher than ever. He realized that in order to truly help others and continue moving forward in his own life, he needed to take a step back and focus on his own health. The first step was simple. He started walking with Max every day, giving himself time to clear his head. He began eating healthier, getting more sleep, and, most importantly, allowing himself moments of rest. It wasn't easy, but Jacob understood now that self-care wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. With Max by his side, he began to regain his strength, both physically and emotionally. And with each passing day, he felt more like the person he had always wanted to be. It had been over a year since Jacob had first walked through the shelter doors, and in that time, his life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. He had a stable job, a purpose, and a growing sense of belonging. But the turning point came one night, when Jacob was invited to speak at a local event about his journey. The event was a fundraiser for the shelter, and they had asked Jacob to share his story to inspire others. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, Jacob felt a surge of emotions. It was hard to believe that he was the same man who had once been homeless, wandering the streets with no hope for the future. Max sat beside him, his tail wagging in the front row, as if cheering him on. Jacob cleared his throat and began to speak. I wasn't always the person standing here tonight, he said, his voice steady. I had nothing, no home, no future, but I had Max and I had hope. And that was enough to get me started. As Jacob shared his story, he could see the faces in the crowd change. People were moved by his journey, by his resilience, and by the bond he shared with Max. It was a turning point for Jacob, one that solidified his belief in the power of second chances. Jacob had always dreamed of having a place to call his own, a space where he and Max could truly begin their new life. And finally, after months of saving, he was able to make that dream a reality. He found a small apartment just outside of town, one that was affordable and perfect for the two of them. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of pride as he moved in, unpacking the few belongings he had. Max, of course, was right there with him, tail wagging as he explored their new home. For the first time in years, Jacob felt truly at peace. He had worked hard for this moment, and it felt as though everything had led up to it. As he sat on the couch, Max curled up beside him. Jacob realized just how far he had come. He had gone from living on the streets to owning a home. The journey had been long, but it had been worth every step. Jacob knew that this was only the beginning. He had a future now, one filled with possibility. One afternoon, as Jacob and Max were out for a walk, they ran into someone unexpected. Jacob's estranged sister, Emily. She had been living in another state, and the two had lost touch over the years. Emily, shocked at the sight of her brother, immediately embraced him. "I heard about everything, Jacob. I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Tears welled up in Jacob's eyes as he hugged her back. For the first time in years, he felt the warmth of family. Emily had always been a reminder of what he had lost, but now she was a part of what he had gained. The two spent the day catching up, and Jacob could see the love and pride in her eyes. It was a reminder that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the connections we build along the way. Max, as always, was there, standing by his side. Emily smiled at the dog. "I can see why you two are so inseparable." Jacob nodded. Max had been there through it all, and now, with his sister by his side, Jacob knew that his family was whole again. As Jacob looked back on his journey, he marveled at how far he had come. From the cold streets to the shelter to a job, and finally a home, he had built a life he never thought possible. Max had been with him through every moment, his loyal companion, his best friend, his constant source of strength. Jacob knew that the journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, but he had learned how to face them. With Max by his side and the support of his new family, Jacob was ready for whatever came next. Together, they had come full circle, one step at a time,